So, it seems as if some of Don's classes come back in voluntarily to be here, and I appreciate that. Just know that I'm here for you. Anytime you need me, you just come in here and we'll take care of you. So, I'm trying a different tactic. I'm trying to go less angry. So anyway, next time, you're all welcome. But tonight we are going to continue in our study of James the Apostle, and we're going to talk about John as well. I'm going to take kind of a hiatus between the two. We're going to talk about James a little more tonight. James and John obviously go together quite a bit. And I'd like to step aside for a moment, and I felt like some of the questions we asked when we talked about Judas Iscariot and Jesus' selection, it might be good for us to stop just for a little bit and talk about the role of an apostle, why apostles were selected and what they did. There is a lot of information, much of it from the mouth of Jesus, about what they were to do and what their role was. And I think it will be helpful as we continue here and as we look back in some we've already studied to understand what they were brought on to do and what they were in, and probably our best indicator of what they were doing in the time we don't have documented. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as well before we move into John the Apostle. All right, let's bow and pray and then we'll begin. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful to you for this time that we have to be together in peace and to study your word. We're thankful that you have given us your word and that you have given us so many good blessings. We're thankful more than anything for your Son, Jesus Christ, and for his sacrifice. We're thankful for the example he gave, for his lessons, and we're thankful that you have given us your church so that we can encourage each other, we can benefit each other, and that we can honor you in the things we do. And we pray all these things in your Son, Jesus Christ's name, and amen. Last time we were looking at Mark 10. You might just go ahead and turn and we'll look at the end of Mark 10. Like I said, there's not a lot said about James by himself, but I wanted to take a couple of stories where James and John are mentioned in particular and study those just to understand a little bit about James. And the story we looked at in Mark 10 is the same as in Matthew 20. Matthew 20 tells us that the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus. And in Mark 10 it says James and John came to him and they asked him for something. What did they ask him for? One to sit on the right and one to sit on the left. In what situation? In his kingdom. And we talked a little bit last time about Jesus' response is obviously the perfect one, where he says, you don't know what you're asking for. We suspect that they had no idea what they were asking for. In fact, they were probably asking to be part of some military leadership or to be part of some political leadership where they knew Jesus was going to be on top and they wanted to be on his right and left. And so it matches kind of the idea of a political unit. But he says to them in verse 38 of Mark 10, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And their answer was what? We are able. And I guess we could have the temptation here of saying they still didn't know what they were talking about. But real quickly, let's look at Acts 12. Acts 12, and you don't necessarily have to turn there, I'll read it real quick. But Acts 12 says, now about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church to do them harm. And he had James, the brother of John, executed with a sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter as well. Now these were the days of unleavened bread. When he had arrested him, he put him in prison, turning him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending only after the Passover to bring him before the people. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made to God intensely by the church. I would love to go into the rest of the story about Peter being in prison and being released, and that's a great story. We'll maybe study another time. But here it tells us that James did meet a violent end, and that Herod killed him with a sword, it says. And so when we go back to Mark 10, it makes sense what Jesus says right after this. Because he says, you don't know what you're asking for. Are you able to partake of this? They said, we are able. And then in verse 39, he said, the cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right hand and my left is not mine to give, but it is for those who have been for whom it has been prepared. So he tells them, okay, you'll partake of this baptism, but I'm not giving away right and left hand. It's not mine to give. It has been prepared by God for others. And so I think it's interesting that he understands their situation. Even though he says to them, you don't know what you're asking for, he does come back and say, listen, I don't give away right hand and left hand. You don't understand what this is. Now, let's go on to verse 41. Hearing this, the other 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. I love when there are verses in the Bible that we don't have any trouble understanding at all. But the fact that they were standing there and they hear James and John walk up and ask for this, what's their maybe natural reaction? Hold on a second. Wait a second. Why in the world would it be you? Why not me? And we'll read another verse here in a minute that gives us more insight into how they interacted. But it says they were indignant. They were upset by this, that they went and asked for this. And then it says in verse 42, calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles domineer over them, and their people in high position exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. Rather, whoever wants to become prominent among you shall be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. I should tell you that I do not believe that there's a better description of the attitude of a Christian than what Jesus describes right here, particularly the relationship of people in the church. Jesus describes it so succinctly and perfectly here, but I think, to me, it's good to know in what context he said this. Sometimes we forget that it was right after he was asked by James and John for this special position, and the others got mad about it, and he said, listen, let me tell you about what my kingdom is like. It is nothing like people grappling for position. The kingdom that I'm bringing has nothing to do with the kingdoms you know about, where people are constantly jockeying to get higher and higher and push other people down to get the highest position they can. He says that you've seen that in other kingdoms. That is not this kingdom. And so I hope we think about that when we think about the church and our relationships with people, that Jesus said, the kingdom of which we are a part, that we are citizens of, isn't about hierarchy. It is not about trying to get a position of power. He says in verse 43, and it's just so perfectly said, it is not this way among you. Whoever wants to become prominent has to do what? Become a servant. And he says, if you want prominence, become a servant. Those are opposites. He says, if you want to be first, what do you have to be? Slave of all. Not just a slave of all. The lowest slave. That is how you become first, by becoming the lowest. And it says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And so I think we cannot, the context of this with James and John and what they asked for and were reprimanded for, and were told that he could not do it, still gave an opportunity for this lesson to them. Not just to them, but all the apostles, for Jesus to say, this is what my kingdom is like. I'm the Son of Man. I've come as the king, but I did not come to be served. I came to serve. Now, I have to tell you that I feel like that statement has almost been totally ruined by American politics. The concept of the person who just is there as a servant, as a public servant, it almost makes us laugh now, doesn't it? That we talk about people who are trying to rise to the highest level of power in politics, and they just talk about, I'm just a simple public servant. I'm just here to serve my community and my constituents. We laugh at that. I just heard chuckles in the room. But when Jesus says this, he invented it. And he said, I am a king, yet I did not come for my servants to serve me. I came to serve them. And how is he going to do that? Gave his life, and he calls it a what? I came, instead of being served, I came to give my life a ransom for many. Now, what is a ransom? Where do we most often use the word ransom outside of the Bible? It's a kidnapping is most often what happens. So in a kidnapping, what happens? Someone is taken, and what's the ransom? Yeah, pay this much or do this thing in order to get your child back. What's that? Okay, I love that you brought that up. She just brought up computers, which is called what? Ransomware. I think you brought up a very important point because a lot of us have started to hear about ransomware. Do y'all know what that is? Raise your hand if you know what ransomware is. Okay. For those of you who did not raise your hand, it is basically someone who gets a malicious computer program on your computer, which locks your computer up until you give them money. And if you give them money, I'm here to tell you, they usually will let your computer go. This is not fake. They will ask you for money. If you give them Bitcoin or some money in some way, they will release your computer. They do that because they want to get money from you next time. And so, in fact, there are some organizations that are very professional. They're not in America, but there are some organizations that after they ransom you, they'll give you a business card, or they actually try to act like real companies. But anyway, you got me off on a tangent. But ransomware, this is a computer being taken hostage unless a price is paid. So how is it that Jesus is a ransom? Why does he call himself giving his life as a ransom? Thoughts on that? Yes, sir. There had to be payment made. And one of the most important words related to ransom is substitute. That is really the concept of ransom, is substitute. What they're basically saying is, instead of this person I've kidnapped, I'll take money. Jesus says, I am putting my life as a substitute so that your life doesn't have to be taken. I'll give my life instead. That is the level to which he was a servant. Have this attitude in yourselves that was in Christ Jesus. This is, to me, I always think of that when I read this verse. Have this attitude in yourselves that was in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, what does it say about that? Did not consider it something to be grasped, but instead, he humbled himself, taking the form of man, taking the form of a servant, and being assassinated, killed as a servant. That's a similar message, but he's proving it here. He's saying, if you want to sit at my right hand and my left hand, I don't have it to give away. But you need to understand, this kingdom is not about that. This kingdom is about humility. It is about serving, not being served. And this whole idea, this concept of looking at people, the value of people, you see people's value differently when you do not consider yourself better than them, or when you are not looking at people with that type of level. We'll talk more about that here in just a minute, but I want to turn to Luke 9 for a few minutes, look at another story with James and John that I think is interesting. There are not very many flattering stories about James, I should say. I'm going to read you the three primary stories about James, or four. One is him being asked to come with Jesus. Another one we just read. We're going to read another one in Luke 9, and then his being killed by Herod are the primary information we have about James. But we see what he said in Mark 10 along with John, and then let's look at Luke 9, a couple sections here. In verse 46, now an argument started among them as to which of them might be the greatest. But Jesus, knowing what they were thinking in their hearts, took a child and had him stand by his side, and he said to him, whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For the one who is least among all of you, this is the one who is great. I obviously see the same message having to be taught here. In this case, it was the apostles arguing over which of them would be the greatest in the kingdom. We have so many little tidbits like this that show us that they were just not getting the point, or that they were just regular people. That these were people that sometimes got off and had to get brought back in, or tried things and they didn't work and Jesus had to bring them back to reality. But in this case, I think maybe we're all surprised that these men were standing around saying, which of us will be the greatest in the kingdom? Maybe it is a natural conversation for a bunch of guys to have when they're hanging out, that they're just constantly trying to one-up. But Jesus was having none of it. And Jesus said the same kind of thing that he said when James and John came to him. You should receive children. The helpless are the people that I value. The one that is least among you will be great. You're trying to figure out who's going to be the greatest? Well, I'll tell you who it is going to be. It's the one who is the least. That's the one that will be the greatest in the kingdom. In verse 49, it says, John answered and said, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow along with us. But Jesus said to him, do not hinder him, for the one who is not against you is for you. And so this is another time we see, once again, John's just trying to say, hey, listen, we saw this thing. We saw a guy casting out demons. Should we get him? And Jesus kind of just puts it aside. And then in verse 51, a story that we know, where it says, when the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead of him. And they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. And they did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. So clearly, he sent messengers ahead. When they knew they were going toward Jerusalem, what did they know about him? They went to the Samaritans, and they heard he was going to Jerusalem, so what did that clue them in on? He was a Jewish person, that these were Jewish people. And so it says, when they found out he was traveling toward Jerusalem, they said they will not receive him. When his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. So when and we don't know about these messengers, it might have been James and John themselves, but messengers who went, and when they came back, they said, they did not receive us. And they said, should we call fire down from heaven to consume them? And other versions, it even says what they were referring to. Where did they get that idea? Yeah, they got that from Elijah, and they said, should we treat them like that? Should we call down fire from heaven? Impetuous. It was this, it's just, and it seems like in all of these situations, they're just trying. And they have energy about this. And Jesus says he rebuked them, and they went on to another village. This is just the way I see it in my head, but it's almost like Jesus just said, hey, just come on, how about we go to another city instead? I can see Jesus just saying, just cool it. And to me, I think these stories, these are really the only times really that James and John are mentioned, or that James is mentioned. Just say something about them. Say something about their energy. Say something about the way that they react to these situations. They have a name. Jesus named them as a pair, in fact. In Mark 3, what did he call them? I want somebody else to pronounce it, is why I'm asking you. I don't know how to exactly pronounce it, but Boanerges or Boanerges, or anybody got a better? No Greek scholars in the room. What does it mean? What did he call James and John? Sons of thunder. And so I think we see pictures of that here. It's like these guys have got a lot going. They are just full of thunder. And it even tells us that's what Jesus called them. And so I think anytime Jesus gives you a nickname, then he's got some insight to that. And so these stories, to me, I think are helpful to us just to see the attitude that they had and what they were doing. All right. I'd like to take some time now, if we can. Anything else we should say about James, or that this is really as much as we've got? Yes, sir. It's about giving direction. And I think sometimes when we hear that he rebuked them, that we think that it was, just an error they can't recover from. But clearly with Peter and with them, even when Jesus rebuked them, it was a moment for him to give them direction. And there was something about them, their energy for this, that maybe we look at it and we think, how could they be so dumb? How could they say that? How could they possibly say that or do that? We should have some compassion, some sympathy for the fact that they were going through this for the first time. They hadn't been studying these passages since they were little kids in church. This was the first time that they were experiencing these things. And so outside of Judas Iscariot, I think we look at the other apostles and some of the things that they did and said that Jesus rebuked them for, and we can't look at that as them being stupid or being rebellious even necessarily. What is it Larry Bird said? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And I think that that's kind of what was going on here with some of them. They were just trying things. They were really just trying. When we talked about Peter, he was just trying as hard as he could. Sometimes he tried something that didn't work, and Jesus had to give him direction. And so I think it is important for us to not demonize them for maybe some of these things that they did that we consider to be irrational or ignorant. All right, anything else about that before we move on? Okay, turn to Matthew 23. I want to start there. I'm going to kind of take you, we're going to look at a lot of passages here, but I want to ask a couple of questions before we move on to our study of John. And the reason is because I just found myself wanting to study this after we talked about Judas Iscariot, and I thought we'd just study it together, because what I wanted to talk about was, what do we learn from Scripture clearly was the charter and the role of an apostle, what Jesus was telling them they needed to be doing and how they were to be doing it, and how does that give us insight maybe into the people he chose? And I think it does. Already what we've read, I think, gives us insight to who he chose. The fact that they wanted to get into positions of power, they wanted to get into positions of authority, and Jesus told them, no, this kingdom is one where the lowest people are the greatest. Immediately that gives us insight into why did he chose who he did. Why did he spend time with the people he did? Why did he evangelize to the people he did? It was because that's who he valued and because his kingdom valued those types of people. But I wanted to start with, when I was trying to understand this better myself, I had to ask myself, what was Jesus dealing with whenever he got there? Whenever he began his ministry, what was he dealing with in the religious community? And I feel like it's interesting at least, that the things that he does and teaches first start with a reprimand of the religious leaders of the day. And he starts to talk about what the Pharisees were like and what the scribes were like. And we see him then, when he is encouraging the apostles and giving them their mission, that it is almost for the exact opposite purpose of what the religious leaders of that day had gravitated to. And so I wanted to read a few passages in Matthew 23 of what Jesus said to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders of the time, that tells us what they valued, which tells us what kind of people they were. But in Matthew 23, in verse 1, then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, whatever they tell you to do, whatever they tell you, do and comply with it all. But do not do as they do, for they say things and do not do them. We'll stop there just for a moment. There's already a good message there. It's not what we would have expected Jesus to say, but he said, when he's talking about the scribes and Pharisees, he says they've seated themselves in the seat of Moses. They have pretty much just put themselves in the position of power where they are the decision makers of the universe, that they own the law. And he says, whatever they tell you to do, do and comply with it all. Is that what we expected him to say? When he tells them, whatever those people do, that I'm about to say woe to a bunch of times, whatever they tell you to do it and comply. But then he says after that, what? But do not do as they do. He is making a separation here. The law of Moses, he still values. He still is wanting to make sure they realize, I'm not here for you to just throw away the law of Moses right now. They're teaching it to you. The law of Moses is true. It is from God. It is right. So when they tell you what they tell you, do it, but don't do as they do. And he explains that a little more in verse 4. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as their finger. And they do all their deeds to be noticed by other people, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at banquets and the seats of honor at the synagogues and personal greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by the people. But as for you, do not be called rabbi, for only one is your teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. I found this little section where he is talking about the scribes and Pharisees. It tells us a lot about what Jesus walked into with that religious leadership in that community, where he says they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on people's shoulders and are unwilling to move with so much as a finger. Now, do you know a passage in our inspired New Testament that says the exact opposite of that? What does it say a Christian is to do to other Christians? Does it say to tie up heavy burdens on their shoulders? What are Christians told to do? Bear one another's burdens. The exact opposite. Not to put burdens on people, take them off. He says they do their deeds to be noticed by other people, and even mentions them specifically when he talks about praying in public places, and that we should instead pray in our closet. When he talks about not doing things, good deeds to be seen. That's what these Pharisees and scribes were all about. And when we think about who he chose and what their mission was, I think it's interesting to see how he was flying in the face of what these religious leaders had done. Now, he starts to say, woe to you. I'm not going to read all of them, but I had a few that I thought we'd point out. Verse 13, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut the kingdom of heaven in front of people. If you do not enter it yourselves, for you do not enter it yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. This is where he's saying you're not inviting people into the kingdom. You're shutting them out of the kingdom. The exact opposite of what you're to be doing. Verse 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. So that's about as harsh a thing as I remember Jesus saying. You go out and what is proselyting? Y'all know what that is? I know you do. It's conversion. You know, it's a conversion. At this time, they were converting them to what? Judaism. So he was converting people basically. But he's saying you're out traveling around. It's like you're going on these mission trips and you're going to convert people. And then when you convert them, it says you turn them into a son of hell. You ruin them. And I think that this is the kind of thing where we've seen it throughout history. That religion gets corrupted and people start converting others to their specific religious organization, and then it gets even more corrupt, and it's a vicious cycle. As opposed to people being converted to Jesus Christ and associating themselves with a faithful church. There are people that are converting others to their church, to saying, come to this local church, or come to this religious organization. He says here, you're proselyting them into you, turning them into you, to Pharisees. In verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. This is another time where he reinforces you should be tithing, but you are neglecting, you're tithing, but you're neglecting justice and mercy and faithfulness, which we see is the very message of the gospel. The exact message of the gospel that he has exemplified and taught and now is being taught to others is justice and mercy and faithfulness. Turn to Luke 20. We'll look at there real quick. Luke 20 and verse 45. And while all the people were listening, he said to the disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love personal greetings in the marketplaces and cheap seats in the synagogues and places of honor at the banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance's sake offer long prayers. These will receive all the more condemnation. So you see a little bit of what we've looked at already, but a couple other tidbits here that I thought we note. One is that he says, of course, they love the greetings and the places of honor, but he says they devour widows' houses. And when I read that, when I've taught that before, when I first read it, I thought, what does it mean to devour widows' houses? And this is a scenario in which they were insincerely going to a helpless widow and saying they would help them. And the way that they would help them is by acquiring their home. and saying, I'll just take care of that. I know that's a burden for you. I'll take that for you. And then guess what happens next? They just keep the home. And now they've got more property. That's the kind of thing that these Pharisees were doing. They were going to widows who were helpless and needed help, and they were stealing from them. And that in the middle of them wanting all of this recognition and to have these fancy clothes and places of honor. And it says, and for appearance's sake, offering long prayers. That is, they wanted everyone to just praise them for how religious they were. This is the picture of the religious teachers and leaders at the time that Jesus started his ministry. And I think John 13, we've already looked at it quite a bit. I just want to touch on John 13 before we move on. But John 13 is really a transition point where you remember, he got down on the floor and started to wash the feet of the disciples, humbled himself, demonstrating exactly what we've seen him say, being a servant rather than being served. And after he did that, he said, so if I, the Lord, and the teacher washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. This is a lesson that he taught them at the beginning of his ministry, to say, you go out and serve in this very humble way. That's the lesson that he was teaching them. Now let's turn over and we'll look at a few verses in Matthew 10. The reason I want to look at Matthew 10 is because I think sometimes we simplify. We think almost that the apostles were just Jesus' evangelism troupe. And he put together a bunch of guys who are really good at performing conversions or going out and they were really good at public speaking. Now, I will say, Jesus clearly gave the apostles the responsibility to go and teach the gospel, to go and convert people to the gospel and convert them to the kingdom. But there was a lot more going on for apostles, clearly, than just that. In Matthew 10, verse 1, Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal every disease and every sickness. Now, I want to point out here that I suspect this means that Judas Iscariot also got this gift. So even though he was a traitor, Jesus gave him the ability to authority over unclean spirits, ability to cast them out, healing sickness and disease. This is a gift that they had that they used as a part of this ministry. In verse 5, these 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, saying, do not go on a road to Gentiles and do not enter a city of Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those with leprosy, cast out demons. Freely you received, freely give. Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your money, or even 2 tunics or sandals, or a staff for the worker, for the worker is deserving of his support. Whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay at his house until you leave that city. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the house is worthy, see that your blessing of peace comes upon it. So you see this picture of them traveling and these instructions he gives them. But he says, go out and raise the dead, heal the sick, cleanse leprosy, cast out demons, give. There, to me, in my mind, there was a lot of this going on that we just don't have recorded. They were going out and they were doing all of these things. They were going around and performing these things. And it says, don't acquire gold, don't get paid for this. Although he does say the worker is deserving of his support. Clearly they were being helped. Their living expenses were being helped, and they were staying with people. But he's saying, don't pile up gold and silver. Don't even have 2 tunics. Just go around and travel and do my work. How different a picture is that of what Jesus selected and began than what was going on in the religious community at that time? It's almost as if he took every single piece of it and did the exact opposite. In verse 16, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be as wary as serpents and as innocent as doves. But be on guard against people, for they will hand you over to the courts and flog you in their synagogues. And you will even be brought before governors and kings on my account as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. This is what they were facing. He needed to prepare them that it was going to be difficult. They were not going to be able to go and do this easily. It was going to be very difficult. Now let's turn over to Matthew 16. So we see that Jesus gave them, these apostles, gifts. He gave them responsibility. He told them that they were going to have a hard time of fulfilling their responsibility. He told them not to become rich doing this, to do it as a servant. And we learn a little bit more. Matthew 16 will only touch on where he was talking to his disciples. He said, who do people say the Son of Man is, you remember? And they had different answers. But this is where we saw Peter say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he said, upon this rock I will build my church. But then he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth, it shall have been loosed in heaven. Then he gave the disciples strict orders that they were to tell no one that he was the Christ. Now I wanted to bring up this. We either skim over this sometimes, or I think we don't give it really enough depth. When he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. This was said specifically to Peter. And I think there are a lot of people who go off in wrong directions just about that. That this was this was Peter being made into the Pope. Or that Peter was supposed to be head apostle. Or that he was supposed to hold some special place throughout time. And it is possible that he was saying this specifically to Peter and not to all of the apostles. But what he's saying is not a strange thing to them concerning the law. The religious leaders at that time, the spiritual leaders, the Pharisees that were handling the law, they would deal with people and they would decide when to bind the law or to loose a law. They would decide the best application of the law in a situation. It was what the concept of what we consider judges now. A person who has wisdom, who is in trying to look at the law and make a judgment in that law. This is what he says to Peter and perhaps all the apostles. They are going to be responsible. Maybe it was a special gift. Maybe it was just inspiration or insight. But they were going to be responsible after he was gone with going to the churches and going to the people and teaching them this new law that was not voluminous. They didn't have giant books that they walked around with, bound books. They were writing it as they went. And so he says to him, I'm giving you this gift, and I expect you to go now and apply my law. What an important job that is for them to be able to go and be able to make sound decisions and understand what God wants of his people and his church. In 1 Corinthians 12, I think you know, it says, we are Christ's body and individually parts of it. You know, the 1 Corinthians, the problem is they're all fighting over what? They're fighting over spiritual gifts. They're all fighting over their position. And he says we're all just members of a body. We're all members of Christ's body. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles and gifts of healing, helps, administrations, various kinds of tongues. All are not apostles, are they? All are not prophets, are they? And so he's talking here most certainly not about a hierarchy of the church. This is not him teaching us that here's the levels of people in the church. The top is apostles, and the bottom is tongues. It doesn't make any sense in this context. What he's teaching them is everyone has a role to play in Christ's body. One of those roles was apostle. Another was prophets. Another was teachers. And so the question arises when we read these things, and the reason I wanted to go about this the way I did is I wanted to ask the question, are we modern day apostles? I've seen arguments on every side of this to say, we're now in the year 2021. Are we the 2021 apostles? And I'll say, the bell just rang, so let me say simply, we are messengers. We are people who bring the gospel. We teach the gospel. We preach. We are people who are messengers of God. But in no way should we refer to ourselves as apostles. Apostles had a very specific role. They had very specific gifts. Those gifts don't exist anymore. They died with the apostles and with those who they gave them to. And so I would say we should always resist the urge to say, oh, now we have the responsibility that the apostles started. An argument can be made for that, but we are not apostles. We are Christians. And Christians all have the same responsibility in the kingdom today. So we'll continue next time into the study of John, but I wanted to just look at what Jesus arrived at with the spiritual leadership of the day and how far off they had gotten and how he brought it back in by choosing simple, lowly, humble people, regular people to be ministers of his kingdom, and then teaching them it's nothing like what the religious leaders have adopted now. Instead, it is about humility and service and to be leaders in this kingdom. Okay, I appreciate your input tonight. We'll look forward to studying John with you on Sunday.